Hi, this is Kelly Hawkins. Thank you for watching. I'm reading The Great Grandfather by Martha E. Figley, also known as the Bender Book, and I'm on chapter 2. Great Grandfather, page 13, chapter 2, America. The land of the free, a place the mother had wanted to bring them to when they were just little children. She had learned of its beauty from friends and books. She knew of towns and cities, also of the mountains that had flowering trees growing all over them, the grass that was almost blue, the little lakes and streams, all the farms, mountains, and villages. It was a place that she and her adopted father often talked about. It was a place they were going to visit when her adopted father was arrested, and she had to flee France and hide her babies. John Jacob was not free as yet, even though the short time he had been in America had made a wonderful change in him. He was now a most humble man, and doubted that his relatives would recognize him. In order to hide his scar under his left eye, he wore a beard, and left his hair growing long. His clothes were getting shabby, and his glassy, staring blue eyes had lost their ice. His frightened look was gone, and the mode of living he chose made him almost unrecognizable to the family. Frederick Charles lived in constant fear, for he was a dead man, but some of his immigrant friends knew his story. Even so, he was afraid, and it was necessary that he take his family to the wilderness at once. And John Jacob and his family would follow, when there was money available, from home and family. What a terrible chance these men took, to leave royalty behind them and risk their lives in the wilderness, among the Indians. Great-grandfather, page 14. Before Frederick had left for the wilderness, there had been a great discussion between the brothers as to what name they should use in America. Frederick could never use his own, and John Jacob could not use his, without giving out information that dare not be told. So they talked it over, and decided to use the name of John Jacob's real father, without the German or French spelling. It would be Bender, and dropping the Van or the D, they would be known as John and Frederick Bender, and Germany would be their native land. John Jacob had to be the spokesman and breadwinner for both families, so his tasks loomed large. He spoke little, but what he said was authoritative, and he demanded instant obedience. After he was better known, even the immigrants respected him highly. The children did not speak to outsiders at all. Only to those acquaintances were their answers direct and unrevealing. They had been trained very early not to speak, but also never to be impolite. But usually their answers meant nothing, and should they question their parents about their former lives, John Jacob and Frederick had but one answer, and that was, "We are Americans now." The children were told very little until after the years of 1860, when so many cousins came over to join them, and they talked freely. How uneasy the family must have been for Frederick. They had moved further back into the wilderness, and John Jacob had to cross many a field to get to his brother's cabin. "We are going to leave the two men now, and go to the new state of Indiana. This is necessary for you to understand the many adjustments they had to make, and the way they would have to live in the wilderness." Great-grandfather, page 15. Okay, so this is where she just talks about life in that time, in that area. But it's not necessarily about the Bonapartes. Although I do think, or Benders, although I do think they are in the story as a neighbor. But we'll see. It's been a while since I read this. Okay. Fort Wayne, Indiana, once a famous Indian village, either traded or sold to the Frenchmen, and also taken over by the British soldiers, it was first established as an American fort in the year 1794, and named after the famous general in charge on that day. Surrounded on all three sides by water, I'm sorry, not all three sides, just three sides, by water, and only one cleared wagon trail coming up from the southeast, it would its way down to Cumberland Gap. That's probably wound its way down to Cumberland Gap. The Indians roaming its woods and waters were peaceful. They soon learned to avoid the military fort when coming up from the south by making an east and west trail about 2 miles south. Later on it was called Pontiac Trail in honor of the famous Indian chief. Some of this trail, no, south of this trail for about 3 miles running east and west was an impenetrable fortress, also a thicket and a swamp. This land proved too much even for the Indian, with all its trees, weeds, waters, and underbrush. South of this wilderness, land was being cleared where immigrant farmers were making their homes. It was to this land that travelers came from the east, some by wagon, others on foot, and many more by pirogue, or boats upon the river. Boats were available to all who wanted them. If there was money to pay for passage, on those boats personal possessions were limited. Down the Ohio River they come, around Cumberland Gap, then up to Fort Venegiz, where they met the Wabash River. It ran north into Ohio, and down again to meet the St. Mary's River, winding south until they neared Fort Wayne, Indiana. Their land could be purchased for $1.25 an acre, with 50 cents down on each acre. And should this land be cleared and a suitable cabin built within a year, a purchase of 100 or more acres was allowed. Great-grandfather, page 16. To our immigrants, the weather had been, and always would be, the greatest problem of all. By the weather he had left the east to cross the large rivers of ice, or wait for the thaw, then men still had to arrive at his destination, or new land had become settled before the old cold weather set in again. There was land to clear, wood to cut, and brush to burn, and a shelter to build, all before the cold weather set in. Some were very fortunate to have relatives or friends with whom they could stay, but accommodations were small, so man had to plant, to cut corn, gather crops, and even take his bath according to the weather. It was in groups that our immigrants come. In groups they also did much work, built their cabins together, gathered wood, and burned brush while the children had one grand picnic, gathering berries, fishing, looking after the animals, and assisting their parents in many ways. Come the bitter colds of winter, wood was constantly cut and brush burned, and should the snows not be deep it was time for father to journey into the north town to buy supplies. If mother could be spared, she went along. Otherwise she put her trust and faith in the Lord and waited for father to return with everything she ordered. But sometimes this worked out in an entirely different way, and father came home broke and with nothing, not even his own horse. Though most all of the settlements had their own saddlery and a small general store with a beer stube on the side. Great-grandfather, page 17. In this large town to the north could be found a place to trade his crops for needed money, to buy those extra supplies and the things mother ordered. Here father visited a barber, sometimes talked to a doctor or priest. Here he paid his debts and learned the latest news of the world. Here in this town to the north was also a dance place with buxom ladies. They wore pretty clothes and smelled beautifully. In this town of Fort Wayne, father would meet friends from other settlements, and in this town he would often order one gift for each of us for Christmas. Then a week or so later, he would come back home again with money in his pockets, striped candy in a striped sack for us, and a wagon piled full of supplies. Often a strange new horse or a cow would be tied to the back of the wagon. Other families were not so fortunate, and the mothers wished they could have gone with father, because sometimes the men returned empty-handed, dirty, no supplies, with strong smelling drinks, or even smelling like a rose. Maybe they had a wagon. It would be empty, but most often no wagon at all, just a horse that was not even his own. We did not need to worry about the Indians. North of us they owned most all of the lands, clear up to the big waters that you could not see across. They had traded the lands, mostly to the French. They had plenty of wampum, good hunting and fishing. Should they be hungry, there was always some man in town wishing to trade, or to cheat for some of their lands. They troubled no one. In the year of 1839, there were still very many Sandusky Indians roaming the countryside and woods. We were used to them, and the only time they troubled us was when they needed help for sick. Great-grandfather, page 18. Injured or a bad toothache. They knew our mothers could help them. Some of the Indians were very shrewd traders, and then again would trade others, and then again others, and then others again would trade their lots or plots of ground for a pint of whiskey. Though the government had rules against this, there just seemed no one around to enforce these rules. So many a white man in town gained much land by cheating the Indian. At the promise of food and drink, many an Indian would really be a great help in erecting a log cabin, though they refused to cut trees or turn bush. They were not just lazy, they had some kind of belief in not doing these things. It was the neighbors and friends who would pull logs with their horses and help erect a cabin. Just imagine a house all your own, the land yours, and what we planted and received from this land we could keep for ourselves. We ourselves had been more fortunate than many. We had owned a mill in Germany, and from this mill we took our names. We had ground grains for others, and there was often not much to grind, especially if the weather had been bad. Then we, along with others, would become ill, and our father said we needed green things to eat, and fruits from the forest, and fresh animal meat. Mother planted seeds for a vegetable garden as early as she could, and soon we were to watch it grow. These things we could oat and keep, or sell what we had no need for. This was America. What a wonderful land. God bless this country. We children gathered many stones, often enough for a floor or chimney, and father had many logs ready for a cabin. Then would come the day for a raising. Great-grandfather, page 19. Neighbors and friends would come from everywhere, many of them with horses. Pulling a load of logs or slabs, very early in the morning they would leave home, often still dark, so they could begin work in the light of day. Women helped as well as the men. Women had sharp eyes and could tell better where one log would fit tighter up against the next one. They helped the children pile up stones for the fireplace. Then it would be time to prepare a meal for the hungry woodsmen. And how they did eat! Often they would have half a cabin up before they would stop and eat and rest. Then we children rested. The men never did. They wanted to finish the big work by nightfall. As long as they had the roof logs up, the owner would finish his cabin at will or time. Slab wood and small strip wood could be used for the roof, and when those were laid, we children would make clay and wood and stone pieces to cover the holes in the roofs. Later we would chink the side walls, and what a wonderful help to keep the inside warm and dry. We were very fortunate. We had some things from Germany called nails. They seemed to be of heavy wire and had 2 prongs. They were just brand new, and very good for fastening narrow strips between the logs. And there stood the cabin in all its glory, a roof over our heads, no rain would harm us, a place to sleep and cook inside of. How wonderful and good everything smelled. Logs of pine, fresh wood, and later on hay and straw. The workmen had been kind and left many hooks in the wall, upon which we would hang our bedding in the daytime, and at night these same hooks would hold many things needed to keep out of our way. Great-grandfather, page 20. The cabins were very small, just one room, and at night we slept upon straw ticks laid upon the floor, until father would find time to fashion some beds or boards upon the side walls. How good it all was, and we could only say, thank you to the Lord and our friends. Father had promised mother a table upon which to do her work. We had so much to do outside that he chose the easiest way. He simply cut a small tree trunk in half and laid it across two of our chinks in the wall, and that was Mother's table for a long time. We had no chairs for a long time. A couple of wooden cartons served the purpose for us, so we could not sit down. We could not sit down at one time. All sit down at one time. Mother, brother, and I had forced some hard wooden sticks between the stones of the fireplace wall, and upon those sticks we hung our pottery. Everything was rough and crude, according to what we had in the old country. It meant many slivers or splinters in our feet, hands, and clothing. Much mending of clothing was necessary, so Mother and I had our hands full. This was Indiana and in America in 1839. We cried for some of the things we had in Europe, but at the same time we knew that some day we would have all the things we left behind, and many much more and much better to take place of our first possessions. Well, I don't think I did such a great job reading, but I appreciate you listening, and thank you.